Hi, today we're going to be talking about bankruptcy, the different types of bankruptcy that exists in this country, and some warning signs as to whether you might be headed toward bankruptcy, and some alternatives that you might want to consider instead of filing for bankruptcy. So let's get started. To begin with, what is bankruptcy? Well, bankruptcy is a legal process that people go through when they are unable to pay their debts. When what you owe is far exceeds what you are able to pay, then people generally stop paying, and the people that they owe money to start to get upset and want to get paid. So they could sue you to get money. So bankruptcy is a way in which people who owe money can protect themselves from lawsuits related to their inability to pay their debt. This process is managed in a courtroom by a judge who makes decisions for you on what you'll repay and how you'll repay it and when you'll repay it. And we'll get to that in a second. Bankruptcy is something that should be viewed as a last resort. All right, it's not something that people should aspire to or should try and use without thinking deeply about whether or not this is the right choice, because it does have major impacts on your ability to get loans into the future and can affect your financial well-being in the short run. So take bankruptcy seriously, because it will lower your credit score. It will make you incapable of getting a loan for anywhere between 5 and 10 years. And that means that if you had money problems before, your money problems are going to get a lot worse. So this is not something that's entered into lightly. And then also, any sort of bankruptcy can affect your ability to get jobs, especially in the financial industry. Employers look negatively on that when they do a credit check. So how do you know that you're getting into debt problems, that bankruptcy may become an issue for you? Here are just a few. They're sort of self-obvious in many regards. If you can't make minimum payments, you've got a major problem, because minimum payments are very low. And if you can't even make those, then there are some serious financial problems going on in your life. If you're taking out one loan to pay out another loan, again, you've got a major problem here, because you just simply lack the resources to pay back what you've borrowed. When you start getting calls from collection agencies, that's an indication that you've stopped paying, and those problems will continue to build and build and build. If you are constantly spending more than you earn, you will find yourself in debt problems and potentially into bankruptcy, and that's why a budget is so important, why we talk about it at the beginning of the course. If you are maxed out on your credit limit, that is, if you've borrowed as much as you possibly can on all of your credit cards, and you need to start looking for another credit card to start buying stuff, you've got major problems. And finally, if you have to start skipping payments on one bill to pay another bill, that's bad news. You definitely lack the resources necessary to pay off all of your debts. If you're in any one of these situations, then you're going to have to start looking at what are some of the alternatives. What are you going to do to get out of this difficulty? Why do we fall into bankruptcy? There's lots of reasons, not just because people are bad people or lazy. Could be that you just failed to plan or budget appropriately, and then you found yourself in a situation where you were in over your head. Maybe you got into credit card debt, didn't realize how much you were racking up, and suddenly something bad has happened to you. Maybe you got sick, or you have an illness that prevents you, or an injury prevents you from going to work. If you're not properly insured, then you're going to have some money problems. Maybe you started a business and pinned all of your financial hopes on it, and it fell through and went out of business, and now you're stuck with lots of debts. And it's nothing that you've done wrong or you're a bad person. It's just that you can't pay the bills, or you lost your job, completely out of your control. Maybe it's because there was a recession. And again, what can you do other than find yourself trying to figure out how you're going to pay bills? So there's lots of reasons why people fall into bankruptcy. But the question then is, what are you going to do when you find yourself in this situation? Before you file for bankruptcy, there are some alternatives you might want to consider. One is what we call refinancing a loan. That is, you take out a new loan with hopefully lower interest payments in order to make it more affordable for you. This might lead you to end up paying more in total for the loan that you took out, but if it helps you stay out of bankruptcy, that might be worthwhile. You could do what's called get a cosigner. That is, find somebody else that wants to share the responsibility for your debt, someone with a better credit score or credit history who can promise on your behalf to the bank that you will pay back your debts. And that's one alternative you could do. The challenge for the cosigner is they're responsible for the loan just as much as you are. And so if you choose to not make your payments, they're responsible for paying off your loan, which is why the best advice for anyone is to never agree to co-sign a loan for somebody else, primarily because if they need a co-signer, they lack the ability to make this loan work out. So bringing you into the fold just puts more responsibility and financial stress on you. And so you're best to say no. Now, if you can find somebody who's willing to be a co-signer for you, that's great. But generally speaking, if you're in a good financial situation, you should never agree to be the co-signer for somebody else. If you do file for bankruptcy, there are two different types, and it depends on whether or not you meet the qualifications for them as to whether you go into what's called Chapter 7 or Chapter 13. So Chapter 7 is the most damaging to you personally and to your personal finances, and it is limited really to those people who earn very little income. So Chapter 7 is what we call a means-tested form of bankruptcy, and it's Chapter 7 because it's the Chapter 7 of the Bankruptcy Code. Right, the law that was passed by Congress to deal with bankruptcy has different chapters in it, and Chapter 7 deals with this type of bankruptcy, where people are means tested. They look at your income and see, do you meet the income requirements to qualify for Chapter 7? If your income is low enough, then you can fall into this type of bankruptcy in which the courts will basically have you liquidate or sell most of your assets in order to pay off your debts. And whatever you don't pay off is forgiven. But it does require you to go through debt counseling and debtor education. There are requirements on you to begin to develop the skills necessary to avoid getting into debt problems again in the future. And the reason it's so damaging in part is because the bankruptcy appears on your credit report for 10 years, during which virtually nobody on this planet will give you another loan until it goes away. And so Chapter 7 is a huge deal. It does get you out of debt. It does eliminate everything that you owed, but then you better be able to be self-sufficient and make it on your own without needing more loans, because you're never going to get one, at least not for the next 10 years. Chapter 13 is a little less drastic, but it's still a huge deal for you personally. In Chapter 13, you do get to keep your assets. You don't have to sell everything to make the debt go away. Instead, the judge in the case will work with you and the people you owe money to create a repayment plan. He'll determine how much you owe to each of the people you owe money to, how much you're going to pay them every month. We'll figure out over the course of 3 to 5 years how much of what you owe you're going to pay. You may pay all of what you owed. You might only pay a portion of what you owed. But you're required to make those payments consistently and on time until the plan is done. You still have to go through debt counseling, but the good news is that once you are done with it, once you've gotten rid of all of your debts, then it only stays in your credit report for 7 years. But again, during those 7 years, it's going to be almost impossible for you to get another loan, which is why it's important to try and find other alternatives before you file for bankruptcy. Even if that alternative is sell everything you got on your own, live in your parents' basement, and eat rice and beans for the next 4 years until you've paid off all your debts, it's way better to do that than it is to file for bankruptcy. At the end of the day, filing for bankruptcy may make your debts go away, but it won't solve your debt problems and it won't solve your debt issues. The only way you can solve your debt issues is to address the real cause of it, which is your behavior. That is, your insistence on spending more than you earned. So unless and until you change your behavior and modify the way that you spend money and plan from month to month, you're going to consistently find yourself back in debt problems. So really the only way to fix your debt issue, the only solution, is to convince yourself to remain debt-free and to avoid taking out loans. Otherwise, you can find yourself right back in the same situation you were again in the future.